You're a nurse, not a physician. Stay in your lane. That is what Dr. Marcus Hayes said 17 minutes before the board hearing that would end his career. But 3 months earlier, nobody knew that. Nobody knew anything at all. Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh sprawled across 6 city blocks like a concrete monument to suffering. The ICU occupied the 3rd floor, where fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer above pale green corridors that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax and the particular staleness of air that had been recycled through industrial filters too many times. At 0600 hours, the shift change had just begun, and the unit moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, monitors beeping in steady rhythm, nurses charting at stations, orderlies pushing stretchers with the quiet precision of people who had learned long ago that noise was a luxury the critically ill could not afford. Katie Morrison moved through this space like she had been born into it, though she had only arrived 3 months prior. Her scrubs were crisp despite the 12-hour shift that had just concluded for the night team. Her movements were economical, no wasted motion, no hesitation. Every step carried intention. She checked vitals on bed 7, the rhythm of it automatic, blood pressure cuff inflated with a pneumatic hiss, oxygen saturation reading on the monitor, heart rate displayed in green lead numbers that climbed and fell with mechanical regularity. The patient in bed 7 was a Navy SEAL recovering from catastrophic combat injuries. His left femur had been shattered by shrapnel during a patrol near the Hindu Kush 3 months ago. His right shoulder bore surgical scars from a rotator cuff reconstruction. His abdomen showed the faint lines of 2 trauma surgeries. He had been in a medically induced coma for 6 weeks. 2 days ago, the sedation had been lightened, and now his eyes moved beneath closed lids as if he were searching for something in the darkness behind them. Katie checked his foresights methodically. The peripheral line in his left arm was patent and running normal saline at a maintenance rate. The central line in his subclavian vein was secured with sterile dressing, placed 4 days ago during a routine assessment. Everything was in order. Everything was perfect. Except. She noticed the tattoo on his left forearm as she adjusted the foretubing. Military stencil font. 3 letters and a period. Katie Morrison. Her hand paused for exactly 1 breath. Then it continued moving, steady as a surgical laser. She adjusted the tape holding the 4 catheter in place and said nothing. She made no expression. But something shifted behind her eyes, a door closing, or opening, or both at once. The supply room was quiet at 0600. Most of the day's shift had not yet arrived, and the night team was finishing their charting at the main stations. Katie pushed through the heavy metal door and let it click shut behind her. The fluorescent lights in here buzzed louder than they should have, casting everything in a sickly green-white hue that made the stacked boxes of gauze and saline bags look like artifacts in a museum of suffering. She reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in faded fabric. A unit patch. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon insignia, worn from handling, the gold thread dull to the color of old brass. She pressed it against her palm, held it there for exactly 10 seconds, and then tucked it back inside the lining of her jacket where nobody would ever find it. Her jaw was so tight her temples ached. She closed her eyes. 10 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. 10 seconds of stillness in the supply closet where nobody could see the armor crack. 10 seconds of controlled breathing, in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, the same technique she had used in the Hindu Kush when rounds were coming in and there was blood everywhere and the medevac was still 8 minutes out. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her scrubs, and returned to the ICU. Dr. Marcus Hayes was beginning rounds at 0630. He was tall, silver-haired, immaculately groomed in a way that suggested his suits cost more than most nurses made in a week. His white coat bore the embroidered logo of Oak Creek Memorial over the breast pocket, and he carried his clipboard the way a general carries a scepter, not as a tool, but as a symbol of authority that preceded him into every room. Katie was charting at the central station when he arrived. She noticed him before he noticed her, which was intentional. She had learned long ago that visibility was a choice, and sometimes invisibility was armor. Hayes glanced at her with the expression most people reserved for elevator music, present and unimpressive. The new nurse. Keep up or transfer out. Understood, doctor. She said nothing else. No apology, no attempt to explain, no defensive posture. Just acknowledgement and return to charting. Her pen moved across the electronic screen with steady purpose. Vitals stable. Foresights intact. Patient responding to stimuli. Neuro exam unchanged. Everything written in the clinical language that meant nothing to anyone outside the medical world and everything to those within it. Hayes moved past her station and approached bed 7, where his new admission was slowly returning to consciousness. The SEAL's eyes were open now, though unfocused. His breathing remained mechanical, assisted by the ventilator that wheezed its rhythm like a sleeping animal. Hayes began his assessment, quick and efficient, the movements of someone who had performed this same evaluation 10,000 times and saw no reason to deviate from protocol. But then the heart monitor changed its rhythm. The beeping accelerated, becoming urgent, staccato, no longer the steady percussion of a resting heart but something arrhythmic and wrong. Katie's attention shifted in half a second, though her body did not move. She was watching. Hayes continued charting, unaware. The monitor alarm was still chirping, still bleeding its urgent electronic distress into the air, and yet he did not look up. Katie felt something cold slide down her spine, not fear, but something colder than fear. Something like recognition. She wheeled her station chair closer to the monitor. The heart rate was climbing. 120. 130. 140. The oxygen saturation was beginning to drop as the compromised cardiovascular system struggled to meet the body's oxygen demands. Katie's eyes moved to the 4 bags hanging above the bed. The medications ordered. The infusion rates. There. On the electronic chart, pulled up on the monitor beside her station. Dr. Hayes had ordered a nephrotoxic antibiotic for a routine prophylactic infection treatment. The dose was correct. But the frequency was wrong. Instead of every 8 hours, he had written every 4 hours, double the intended dosage, which over 72 hours would accumulate in the kidneys until they simply shut down. Acute kidney injury, renal failure, dialysis, sepsis, and finally, if not caught, cardiac collapse. Katie did not hesitate. She stood, moved to the bedside, and very carefully began reviewing the 4-line and the medication hanging above it. Her voice was quiet and professional when she spoke, loud enough for only the patient and the bedside monitor to hear. "Let me adjust the infusion rate on this antibiotic," she said to nobody and everybody at once. She adjusted the pump, reducing the frequency to match the correct protocol. 8-hour intervals. She documented the change in the electronic medical record with the notation, rate corrected per standard dosing protocol. Original order appeared to contain frequency error. The heart rate on the monitor began to descend. 130. 120. 110. The urgent staccato beeping gradually returned to normal rhythm. The oxygen saturation climbed back to acceptable levels. Hayes looked up from his clipboard. "What did you just do?" Katie's hands remained steady. Her voice remained level. Corrected a medication dosage frequency that appeared inconsistent with standard protocol. "You adjusted my orders." "The order contained an apparent error," Katie said. "I documented the change." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze. Hayes walked over to the monitor, reviewed the notes she had entered, and his face underwent a transformation so sudden and complete that it seemed to happen in reverse. The professional courtesy drained away. The thin smile vanished. What remained was something harder, something that looked at Katie with the expression a predator reserves for prey that has somehow drawn blood. "You overstepped your authority," he said, and his voice carried the kind of authority that made the very air pressure change. "You are a nurse, not a physician. You do not adjust medication orders. You do not make clinical decisions. You document them and report them to the attending physician, who then decides what action, if any, is appropriate." Katie did not respond. The family of the patient had arrived during the morning shift, a wife, 2 teenage children, an elderly mother whose hands trembled as she stood at the bedside of the man whose blood they shared. They had heard every word of this exchange. Hayes turned to them with a smile that could have frozen water. "I apologize for the unprofessional behavior of my nursing staff. I assure you that your loved one's care will receive only my personal attention from this point forward. Nursing errors are a serious matter." He looked directly at Katie now, and in that look was a clear and unmistakable message: "I will not forget this." Katie returned to her charting. Her jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. Her hands remained steady as she documented the remainder of her shift notes. She did not look at the family again. She did not look at Hayes again. She finished her charting at 0710 hours, 15 minutes before the end of her shift, because every protocol required documentation complete and reviewed before handoff. At 0730, when she had removed her scrubs and changed into street clothes, when she was walking down the hallway toward the parking lot, she passed the supply closet. She did not go in. She kept walking, because sometimes the bravest thing was to keep moving when everything in you wanted to stop and fall apart and surrender to the weight of it all. But her left hand moved unconsciously to the inside of her jacket pocket, where the unit patch rested against her ribs like a second heartbeat, and she permitted herself exactly 10 seconds of controlled breathing before she pushed through the exit doors into the Raleigh morning and headed toward a home that would never, ever truly be home again. The break room door opened at 1215 hours. Katie Morrison carried her sandwich wrapped in foil, her scrub still damp from a code blue that had run 43 minutes. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made living people look like corpses. 4 nurses sat at the table. 2 techs stood by the refrigerator. All of them looked up. All of them, in that synchronized moment, decided something else needed them elsewhere. "Bathroom," one said. "Charting," another muttered. Within 90 seconds, the break room held only Katie and the hum of the vending machine. She Saturday. She unwrapped her sandwich. Turkey and mustard, the same lunch she'd eaten for 17 days straight because it didn't require decisions. She took one bite and felt the weight of the room's emptiness settle against her like a tactical vest made of silence. She chewed. She swallowed. She did not let her jaw clench. Not visibly. The training held. 18 years of compartmentalizing, carrying wounded men through fire, holding pressure on wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, moving through villages where any shadow could end you, had given her a face like stone. A face that showed nothing when everything inside was fracturing. It wasn't the isolation itself. Isolation she understood. She'd spent 48 hours in a Taliban compound with a dislocated shoulder and 2 fractured ribs, communicating through hand signals and will alone. But this was different. This was Dr. Marcus Hayes orchestrating her exile with the precision of a military operation, and she recognized the tactics because she'd studied them in command training. First, plant doubt in the minds of junior staff. Second, create social pressure through subtle messaging. Third, let the target's own unit turn against her. She took another bite of sandwich. It tasted like cardboard and regret. By lunch the following Tuesday, the pattern was established. Katie would arrive during the 15-minute window between morning shift change and afternoon rounds. The room would empty. Not dramatically. Not with visible rudeness. Just a gradual realization that everyone suddenly had somewhere to be. Patients who needed blood pressure checks. Charts that couldn't wait. A moment to check the supply room. She learned not to eat in the break room anymore. Instead, she sat in her car in the parking lot, a 2009 Subaru with 147,000 miles and a check engine light she ignored, and consumed her meals while staring at the brick wall of Oak Creek Memorial's east entrance. The wall was the color of dried blood. She'd noticed that detail on day 3. What happened next didn't change anything but made everything crystalline clear. Thursday morning, 0745 hours. Katie approached the unit bulletin board near the nursing station to sign off on the overnight census. A printed sheet hung there, centered, bearing her name at the top. Formal written warning. T.O. Katie Morrison, R.N. From Dr. Marcus Hayes, Senior Physician, Cardiac ICU. Pattern of policy violations and boundary infractions. Date, current date. 14 infractions listed below. Charting delays of 3 to 7 minutes on vital signs documentation. Unauthorized initiation of patient monitoring protocols without physician authorization. Persistent boundary violations regarding physician authority and chain of command hierarchy. Failure to adhere to established reporting structures. 3 instances of medication reconciliation performed without supervision. 2 instances of patient assessment conducted outside standard nursing scope. Her hand didn't shake as she signed the acknowledgement line. 8 people watched from various distances, clustered near the medication dispensary, standing near the patient monitors, pretending to review charts. Her eyes met none of theirs. She initialed the line. The date. Her full signature, Katie Morrison. "Thank you for acknowledging receipt," Dr. Hayes said from behind her. His voice carried the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. "I trust you understand the seriousness of these concerns." "Yes, Doctor. Perhaps we can use this as an opportunity for recalibration." She turned from the bulletin board. His smile suggested a wolf showing its teeth before the kill. "I understand." "Excellent. That will be all, clipboard." The nickname hung in the air like smoke. Clipboard. Suggesting she was competent only for paperwork. Suggesting her hands, her training, her instincts meant nothing. She watched his back as he walked toward the physician's lounge, his white coat immaculate, his bearing suggesting a man who had already won and was simply waiting for her to accept it. During her break, which she took alone in the supply closet on the 3rd floor instead of the break room, Katie permitted herself exactly 10 seconds. Eyes closed. Controlled breathing. Hands braced against the metal shelving unit, feeling the cold bite of the brackets against her palms. The shelves held boxes of 4x4 gauze pads, compression wraps, saline flushes, and the 1,000 small tools of keeping people alive. Around her, the smell of antiseptic and plastic. Above her, a single flickering LED panel casting everything in a shade of blue that suggested drowning. 10 seconds. Then her eyes opened. Then she returned to the floor. That evening, during evening rounds at 1800 hours, she checked on Lieutenant Aaron Webb. He remained sedated, the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the heart monitor beeped its steady reassurance. His left forearm bore the tattoo she'd carried like a stone in her chest for 8 weeks, Katie Morrison, tattooed in blocky capital letters during a moment of clarity she'd never asked him to explain. The last time they'd spoken, he'd been conscious in a field hospital outside Sanjin Valley. She'd been holding pressure on his femur while his eyes tracked her face like she was the last real thing in a world turning liquid and wrong. Now he slept. Now he didn't know her. Now she was just another nurse checking his vitals while the hospital orchestrated her slow erasure from every space that mattered. She documented his vital signs: blood pressure 118/74. Heart rate 82. Respiration rate 14. O2 saturation 98% on the ventilator. Temperature 37.2 Celsius. Everything normal. Everything stable. Except his left leg. She ran her fingers along the skin of his calf, feeling for the subtle signs of compartment syndrome, the tightness, the slight shine to the skin that indicated swelling beneath the muscle fascia. The dorsalis pedis pulse was still present, but diminished. She pressed gently against the anterior tibialis muscle. The skin had the consistency of a ripe fruit, firm, tight, ready to split. She pulled up his most recent surgical notes. Dr. Hayes had written, "Monitor overnight. Reassess 0800. No measurements. No compartment pressure readings. No sense of urgency." At 2200 hours, Katie measured compartment pressure using the handheld monitor kept in the ICU supply room. The pressure read 45 millimeters of mercury. Critical. The normal threshold was 30. Above 30, tissue began dying. Above 45, death accelerated. She paged Dr. Hayes. No response. She paged him again at 22:30. Nothing. At 22:47, she paged him a third time. The supervisor appeared at the nursing station, tablet in hand. He left instructions. No calls except codes. Katie nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't explain the compartment pressure reading. She didn't say the words that would trigger the cascade: emergency surgical decompression. Fasciotomy. 3 hours in the OR that Hayes controlled like a thief. Instead, she returned to Webb's bedside. The tattoo on his arm caught the light from the monitors. Katie Morrison. 8 weeks of this man sleeping, and the man never knowing that the woman checking his vitals had carried him 3 miles through the Hindu Kush with a shattered femur of her own, whispering coordinates into a radio between labored breaths, feeling his weight against her shoulders like the entirety of her purpose made physical and desperate and real. He'd been awake then. He'd gripped her hand with the strength of someone trying to anchor himself to the living world. "Don't leave me, Phantom," he'd said. Now she was just a nurse. Now he was just a patient. Now the tissue in his leg was dying in 90-minute increments while his senior physician refused to answer her pages. Katie's phone sat heavy in her scrub pocket. She'd been given a number, a direct line to naval intelligence, to the operation that had placed her here, to the people who needed to know why someone had tried to kill this SEAL in his hospital bed during the first week of his recovery. Calling that number meant revealing the operation. It meant admitting that her nursing position wasn't just employment. It meant sacrificing the mission she'd accepted the moment she agreed to come to Oak Creek Memorial under assumed civilian status. She pulled out the phone. Her thumb hovered over the encrypted contact. Then she closed the screen. She set the phone face down on the counter beside Webb's bedside monitor. She walked to the surgical supply room. She removed the equipment she would need. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of field hospitals and trauma tents and moments when the difference between someone living and someone dying came down to knowing which instrument went where and having the courage to use it. Behind her, the ventilator wheezed. The heart monitor beeped. The fluorescent lights hummed their institutional hymn. She had maybe 90 minutes before permanent damage. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the bravest thing was to act alone, to make the choice that no one would authorize, to save someone even if it cost you everything. She was through waiting for permission. The fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial's ICU cast everything in that peculiar institutional white, sterile, bright, utterly devoid of shadow. Katie Morrison stood at the nurse's station at 1800 hours, her scrub still damp from the afternoon shift, watching the heart monitor tracing scroll across the screens like silent testimony. Routine vitals. Stable numbers. The kind of data that meant nothing if you didn't know what you were actually looking at. She pulled up the chart for patient Webb, the SEAL who'd been intubated for 72 hours now, his muscular frame looking diminished against the ventilator's rhythm, the machinery doing the breathing his lungs couldn't yet manage. His left leg lay elevated on a pillow, wrapped in compression bandaging that was supposed to prevent clotting. The file was flagged. Priority patient. No visitors without administrator clearance. Katie had seen those flags exactly twice in her career, once for a federal witness, once for a diplomat's daughter. The dispatcher in her ear, the one nobody at Oak Creek knew existed, had been quiet for weeks. But the message had come through at shift change, embedded in what looked like a routine system notification about continuing education requirements. 30 seconds of audio, then deleted. Your asset remains compromised. Maintain position. Do not deviate. Asset. That's what they called him in the encrypted messages. Not a person. Not the man whose arm bore her name in dark ink, a promise made in the noise and chaos of a firefight in Kuna Province, 6 years ago. The intel briefing had come to Katie in a sealed envelope 2 weeks before she'd accepted the nursing position at Oak Creek Memorial. Classified. No phone. Her orders were explicit: embed as bedside nursing staff, monitor SEAL Team 3 operative call sign Phantom during medical recovery, and identify the source of the security breach that had led to the assassination attempt during his initial hospital stay in Germany. Someone inside the system wanted him dead. Someone with enough access to know his location, his medical status, his vulnerable window. That someone was still inside Oak Creek Memorial. Katie had carried Webb 3 miles through the Hindu Kush with a shattered femur of her own, whispering grid coordinates into her radio between labored breaths, both of them bleeding out slowly while Reaper drones circled overhead and Taliban fighters closed in from 3 directions. She'd gotten him to the LZ 17 minutes before the Black Hawk came in hot. That was 6 years ago. He'd survived then because she'd refused to leave him behind. Now he lay in front of her, sedated and paralyzed, a breathing tube doing the work his lungs couldn't manage, unable to recognize the woman checking his vitals twice per shift, unable to know that the nurse in blue scrubs was the same person who'd pressed a faded task force unit patch into his hand during those final minutes before extraction, the patch sewn inside his jacket lining ever since, his only reminder of the woman called Phantom who'd saved his life. The cruelty of it sat in her chest like a stone. Webb's afternoon labs had shown the first indicators of something wrong. His leg was warm to the touch, the skin taking on a mottled appearance despite the compression wrapping. Katie had flagged it in the chart. Elevated creatinine phosphatase. Myoglobin in the urine. The classic markers of compartment syndrome, of muscle tissue dying from lack of blood flow, toxins spilling into the bloodstream, a cascade of cellular death that would claim the limb if not stopped within hours. She'd paged Dr. Hayes at 1,430 hours. No response. She'd paged him again at 1,505 hours with escalating clinical data. The night shift nurse, Melissa, had pulled Katie aside near the supply closet. Hayes marked you as being under review, she'd whispered, eyes apologetic. He told us to document observations but not to, get involved with your patient management. He said you were overstepping. That was the weapon Hayes had chosen. Not confrontation. Not direct conflict. Institutional isolation. Make the other staff see her as a threat to hierarchy, and they would stop supporting her. Stop believing her assessments. Stop backing her up when she raised concerns. The brilliance of it made Katie's jaw tighten imperceptibly. At 2,315 hours, in a house in the Boylan Heights neighborhood of Raleigh, Dr. Marcus Hayes sat in his study with a bourbon that cost more than Katie's monthly rent. His phone buzzed. The ICU alert system. Emergency notifications from the night shift. He looked at the screen, saw Katie's name in the queue of pages, and deliberately silenced the phone. He'd been building this case for 8 weeks. Documented every instance of her stepping outside nursing scope. Photographed her hands moving too confidently during patient assessments. Noted every time she'd spoken with the authority of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions without waiting for permission. That kind of independence was dangerous in a hierarchical system. That kind of quiet competence threatened men like him. If she tried an unauthorized procedure, if she overstepped so catastrophically that it was undeniable, so clearly documented that the hospital's legal team would be left with no choice but termination, then the problem solved itself. Her competence would become her destruction. He drank his bourbon and waited, confident in the power of institutional inertia. Even the best nurses eventually exhausted themselves fighting against a system designed to contain them. He had no idea he was sabotaging a naval intelligence operation. In the ICU, Katie's assessment at 2,245 hours showed Webb's leg had crossed into the danger zone. Compartment pressure at 42 millimeters of mercury. The normal range was 15. Anything above 30 meant tissue death was beginning. The skin had gone from mottled to a sickly gray in the space of 2 hours. His distal pulses were fading. She documented everything with timestamps, medical notes precise and detailed enough that any competent physician reading them would understand the urgency. She paged Dr. Hayes again. No response. She waited 18 minutes and paged him once more. The silence that came back was louder than any refusal. Katie stood in the supply closet at 2,300 hours and permitted herself exactly 10 seconds of closed eyes and controlled breathing, her stoic mask intact everywhere but here, in this narrow space between shelves of gauze and foretubing. The trembling that moved through her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. Pure, physical restraint of the kind that came from years of training to act while everyone else froze. She opened her eyes. Webb's leg was dying. The window to save it was closing, maybe 40 minutes now, maybe less. She could wait for Hayes. She could call the on-call physician and watch the chain of command spiral slowly through layers of bureaucracy while the tissue necrotized. She could follow protocol and watch the patient she'd been sent to protect lose the limb anyway. Or she could do what she was actually trained to do. Katie pulled up Webb's chart one more time and documented everything. She noted the clinical presentation. She noted the failed pages to Dr. Hayes at 1,430 hours, 1,505 hours, 2,245 hours, 2,303 hours. She timestamped each entry with meticulous precision, creating a paper trail that would either protect her actions or damn them, depending on what happened next. She gathered what she needed: a sterile field kit, local anesthetic, betadine, trauma shears, a 15-blade scalpel that felt familiar in her hand the way guns felt to other soldiers. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who'd done this before in field hospitals across 3 deployments, in Kandahar when a Marine's IED injury had left his leg swelling toward death, in Helmand when a village elder had been caught in a crossfire, in the back of a Humvee rolling toward a surgical team that never made it. Pain is data. Compartment pressure is a countdown. Muscle tissue without blood flow dies in increments of minutes, not hours. The room went quiet when she closed the curtain around Webb's bed. The night shift staff noticed the unusual activity, noticed Katie's presence with a kind of focused intensity that didn't invite questions. But they didn't intervene. Hayes had made clear that Katie was under review. That meant document, don't support. That meant distance. That meant let her hang herself. Katie didn't need their permission anyway. She applied local anesthetic in a line down his lateral leg, the needle sliding in with practiced precision, waiting the 2 minutes for the lidocaine to take effect. She prepped the incision site with betadine, watching the skin turn that particular shade of orange-brown, the smell of iodine sharp in the air. She retrieved the scalpel, 15-blade, sharp enough to part skin and fascia without crushing tissue, her hands completely steady. The first incision was 4 inches long, along the lateral compartment just below the knee. The skin parted like a door opening. Dark blood welled up immediately. The pressure inside the compartment had been building for hours, stretching muscle against unyielding fascia until the vessels started rupturing from the inside. As she deepened the incision through the fascia, the pressure released with an almost audible hiss, and her peripheral vision caught movement, the distal pulses, suddenly visible again, color returning to the skin beyond the incision as the blood flow rushed back to tissue that had been starved of oxygen for too long. She worked with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this when mortar rounds were incoming, when the only light was what a headlamp could provide, when the margin between saving a life and losing one was measured in the steadiness of your hands and the clarity of your decision-making. Webb's compartment syndrome was going to reverse. The limb would survive. The tissue would recover. And in exactly 30 minutes, when Dr. Hayes finally arrived, prompted by a worried resident who'd heard about the emergency and couldn't reach the attending, he would find Katie closing the fasciotomy incision with sutures that looked more like military field repair than anything a bedside nurse was authorized to perform. Her cover was about to explode. Her embedded position was about to become impossible. The operation she'd maintained for 2 months was about to implode into something visible and undeniable. But the SEAL's leg was going to live. She tied off the final suture and met the eyes of the night-charge nurse, who stood frozen in the doorway, watching something she had no framework to understand. Katie's voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of someone accustomed to command, someone far older than her years. "Call cardiothoracic. Webb's pressure's dropping. I need a surgical team." It wasn't a request. It was a command, and everyone in that ICU suddenly understood that the timid nurse they'd stopped supporting had been something else entirely all along. The monitors registered what her hands already knew. O2 saturation climbing. 75. 82. 88. Stable. Webb's leg had turned the color of old concrete an hour ago, the skin waxy and mottled from the knee down, tissue death progressing like a clock nobody wanted to watch. Katie had paged Dr. Hayes at 0159. Then 0203. then 0217. Then 0234. 73 minutes of silence while compartment pressures climbed above 50 millimeters of mercury, while muscle began converting to necrotic waste, while the window between saving and amputation closed like a fist. The ICU hummed around her, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, the cardiac monitor kept its steady electronic pulse. Katie stood at Webb's bedside in the fluorescent glare, studying the leg with the same clinical precision that had kept 17 Marines alive through 3 tours of the Hindu Kush. Compartment syndrome didn't care about hierarchy. It didn't care about protocol. It cared about time. For hours now since the swelling started. Maybe 6 before the femoral artery would be squeezed shut entirely. She'd tried using the chain of command. The charge nurse had nodded sympathetically and said Dr. Hayes was in the physician's lounge. Katie tried again at 0210. Still in the lounge. At 0224, the charge nurse's face had shifted. She'd finally understood what Katie was really asking. Not for a callback. For permission to do what Hayes wouldn't do. Katie saw it register. Saw the moment the charge nurse chose silence over protocol. At 0237, Katie pulled on fresh gloves. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of field hospitals in Kandahar, of blast injuries treated on helicopter floors, of limbs saved because someone refused to wait for authorization. The 14-gauge angiocath needle went in at the medial and lateral compartments first, the needle finding tissue planes with a confidence that came from having done this under conditions far worse than a quiet ICU. Saline flowed in. Pressures released. The needle advanced to the anterior and deep posterior compartments, each one a separate battle being won by a woman in blue scrubs that nobody had bothered to learn the name of. 60 centimeters of incision along the anterior tibial region. The scalpel moved like it was following a map only she could read. Fascia released in layers. The tissue beneath gasped, depressurizing like air escaping from a tire. Katie's breathing stayed level. Controlled. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. O2 sat climbing toward normal. The femoral artery resumed its pink perfusion down the calf, color returning like someone turning up a dimmer switch. She was closing at 0316 when the ICU doors pushed open. Footsteps. Slow ones. Measured. The kind of walk that knew it was about to own a room. Dr. Hayes stopped 3 feet from the bedside. His eyes moved from Webb's leg to Katie's face to the open incision in her hands. His expression didn't change. He simply pulled out his phone. For photographs. Different angles. Clinical documentation. Then he began typing notes into his screen, not checking vitals, not verifying the procedure, not once glancing at the monitor displaying the restored blood pressure and climbing oxygen saturation. Just typing. Katie tied off the final suture. Her voice came out level, measured. Compartment syndrome. Pressures above 50. For pages over 73 minutes. I documented everything. She didn't say I saved his life. She didn't say you didn't come. Protocol violations were facts. Facts didn't require emotion. Hayes looked up slowly. His voice was quiet, more dangerous than shouting, the kind of whisper that makes the room contract. You performed surgery. Without authorization. Without supervision. You performed a fasciotomy on a patient, Commander. He paused. The word hung there. Commander. Wrong context. Wrong uniform. Wrong everything. That determination wasn't yours to make. His leg would be dead. Katie removed her gloves carefully. By 0700, tissue necrosis would have been irreversible. Amputation only option. I documented the timeline. Hayes's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough for Katie to see the rage underneath the composure. He was typing again before she finished. I'm calling an emergency ethics committee meeting. 0700, you'll surrender your credentials pending investigation. he turned and walked out, already composing the incident report that would invoke subsection 2847.3 of the 1987 North Carolina Medical Statute restricting surgical procedures, the bureaucratic machinery he'd been constructing for months finally springing shut around her like a trap. Katie looked at Webb. His color was good. His pressures stable. His leg saved by a person he would never remember. She clocked out at 0345. The ethics committee met in a room with wooden paneling and a table shaped like a coffin. 5 administrators. 2 physicians. Hayes presenting. He'd prepared a dossier, the 14 prior infractions from months of documentation, tonight's unauthorized surgery, photographs from 4 angles, a timeline showing pattern of insubordination. He was very calm. Very professional. He invoked policy subsections and regulatory codes and liability exposure. He talked about the dangers of nurses operating outside their scope. He talked about the hospital's responsibility to protect patients from incompetence. Katie stood across from them in scrubs she'd worn for the last time. She tried to explain that the patient's compartment pressures were above the threshold for tissue death, that the 4-page attempt to reach Dr. Hayes had been documented, that leaving this position meant abandoning an active protective operation. But she couldn't say why without revealing the naval intelligence assignment. Couldn't say SEAL team security threat without compromising sources and methods. Couldn't defend herself without betraying the mission. The words stuck in her throat. The committee voted 6-1 to terminate her employment effective immediately, citing unauthorized surgical procedure, violation of scope of practice, and failure to maintain proper chain of command. Hayes didn't smile. He didn't need to. The machinery had worked exactly as designed. Katie turned in her badge at 0753. The diner off Highway 40 was open 24 hours for people with nowhere else to go. The fluorescent lights flickered at irregular intervals like Morse code from something dying slowly. Katie sat in a cracked vinyl booth with cold coffee she hadn't touched, staring at her reflection in the darkened window outside. Hollow-eyed. Defeated. A person who'd carried 17-pound loads through mountain passes under enemy fire but couldn't protect herself from a man in a suit and a paper trail. 7 pages she'd sent. 7 messages ignored. 7 calls Dr. Hayes didn't answer while tissue died and a patient's leg moved toward amputation, and Katie Morrison, Commander, United States Navy SEAL, did what she was trained to do and destroyed her own operational cover in the process. Her phone had 17 missed calls from a 757 area code. Naval intelligence. She didn't answer. What would she say? That she performed an emergency fasciotomy and compromised everything? That the security operation was now vulnerable because Dr. Hayes had forced her to choose between a patient's life and her mission? That both were lost anyway? The waitress refilled her coffee without asking. Katie didn't acknowledge her. The reflection in the window stared back, expressionless and utterly, completely alone. Outside, rain began hammering the parking lot like applause for someone else's victory. The hospital board convened at 0800 in the mahogany-lined conference room on the 3rd floor, the kind of space designed to intimidate, high ceilings, leather chairs, a table that could seat 20 and had been polished to a mirror finish that reflected nothing back but power structures and money. Dr. Hayes arrived with documentation prepared. He'd spent the previous night assembling his case, his presentation folder color-coded and cross-referenced, every page a brick in the wall he'd built methodically over months. The board members settled into their seats with the comfortable posture of people accustomed to being obeyed. Hayes's attorney sat to his right, a sharp-eyed woman with a diamond the size of a child's fist on her wedding ring. The room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular antiseptic scent of institutional authority. Then the door opened. Katie Morrison walked in, and she was no longer alone. Behind her rolled Lieutenant Commander Webb in a wheelchair, his left leg still bearing the slight swelling of recent surgical recovery but alive, there, present, breathing. His eyes were clear. Alert. The eyes of someone who'd emerged from the medical fog and remembered everything. Webb looked directly at Hayes. Then his gaze found Katie, and something behind his eyes ignited like a flare shot into a night sky. His lips moved, and the words came out in a whisper sharp enough to cut through the room's manufactured silence. Phantom. The word landed like a detonation. It was a call sign. It was a name. It was 7 years of operations compressed into a single syllable, and nobody in the room understood what they'd just heard except the people who'd lived it. The security guard positioned near the door, a man named Clayton with a scar that carved his left cheek in half from temple to jaw, straightened his posture with the sudden rigidity of someone recognizing rank. "That's Commander Morrison, sir," he said, and his voice carried the weight of Kandahar, of convoy escorts, of watching someone move through an ambush with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the unsurvivable. The guard's eyes fixed on Katie with something between respect and awe. He'd known. Or at least, he'd suspected. Security personnel always notice the ones who carry their violence quietly. The hospital administrator, a man named Rothschild who'd spent 40 years climbing institutional ladders, sat rigid in his chair. But his father, retired Major General Edward Rothschild, a man whose shoulders still carried the weight of command even though his uniform had hung in a closet for 17 years, leaned forward with the deliberate movement of someone who'd just made a calculation that changed everything. The general pulled up Katie's service record on the tablet in front of him. His reading glasses descended from his forehead to the bridge of his nose. He began reading aloud, his voice steady and level like an announcer calling a roll call of the dead, but the dead in this case were the ones who'd lived through impossible things. "Bronze Star for heroism under fire," he said, and the room held its breath. "Silver Star for extraordinary valor in Helmand Province." His voice dropped an octave. The board members exchanged glances they thought were subtle. They weren't. "Second Silver Star. Sanjin Valley, 2014. The general paused. Adjusted his glasses. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 for fragmentation wounds sustained while coordinating a casualty evacuation. The second for shrapnel from an IED near Jalabad that she treated herself in the field and never reported until 36 hours later. He stopped reading. Looked up. Looked directly at Katie. And a Navy Cross. Presented by Admiral Stavridis himself. For refusing to leave a teammate behind when extraction helicopters were compromised and hostile fire was incoming from 3 separate positions. The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their mechanical song above the table. Webb reached into his jacket with a movement that made the security guard's hand shift subtly toward his radio, a reflexive gesture, unnecessary but understandable when a patient in a wheelchair suddenly reaches for something. But what emerged from the inner pocket was worn fabric. Faded. The colors barely distinguishable anymore from months of being pressed against his body, against his heart. A unit patch. Task Force 121. The insignia that meant you'd operated at the highest level of classified authority, the kind of work that existed in redacted paragraphs and deniable operations. "This," Webb said, holding the patch up so the light caught the tattered edges, "she pressed into my hand. We were taking fire from 2 mosque minarets simultaneously. Her femur was fractured. I found out later it was a clean break through the bone, not the kind you walk on, the kind you lose consciousness from." His voice didn't shake. Military voices don't when they're recounting documented facts. She whispered grid coordinates into her radio with one hand while applying a tourniquet to her own leg with the other. 3 miles. We moved 3 miles through the Hindu Kush with hostile fire tracking us the entire way. She never once told me to leave her. Never once stopped moving. Never once acted like carrying me was anything other than the job. He placed the patch on the conference table. It sat there like a relic from another world, because it was. It was from a world of classified operations and dark missions, from the spaces where the real work happened, the work that never made the news because it couldn't. The general picked up the patch. Examined it carefully. Placed it back down as if it were made of glass and might shatter. Dr. Hazy's attorney leaned over and whispered something urgent into his ear. Hayes didn't respond. His face had gone the color of old concrete. His hands, which had been folded with such careful composure on the table, had begun to sweat. And that's when the doors to the conference room opened again, and this time it wasn't another person. It was an investigation. the hospital's compliance officer, a methodical woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd been quietly conducting secondary reviews of Hayes's cases since the fasciotomy incident, carried a folder containing what she'd found over 487 man-hours of careful documentation cross-referencing. She placed it on the table with the deliberate precision of someone who'd spent her entire career building cases from evidence instead of assumptions. "Dr. Hayes," she said, "during our routine secondary review of cases following the reported compartment syndrome incident on March 14, we discovered documentation irregularities across 6 cases spanning the last 18 months. She opened the folder. Began reading. Case 047, surgical complication marked as post-operative hemorrhage, documented as occurring at 18:47 hours. However, the operative notes indicate the procedure concluded at 1623 hours. Records were altered. Timestamp changed. The actual complication occurred during the procedure, not after." Hayes's attorney stood up. "This is highly irregular. Any secondary review should occur through proper channels." "We are utilizing proper channels," Chen interrupted, not unkindly. "I'm the proper channel." "Continue, Dr. Chen." This from the general, who'd resumed his seat but now carried himself with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed without repetition. Chen continued methodically through the cases. 3 separate incidents where post-operative documentation had been altered to conceal surgical errors. 2 patients who'd suffered complications directly attributable to Hayes's technical failures, complications he'd tried to hide by burying them in carefully worded amendments and timestamp adjustments. His meticulous documentation habits, the same bureaucratic precision he'd weaponized against Katie, had become a timeline of falsehoods. Every note he'd made to protect himself now formed a perfect record of his deception. The room went so quiet you could hear individual breaths. Hayes's hand trembled. His face had shifted from concrete gray to something closer to ash. His attorney was already on her phone, stepping into the hallway, presumably calling someone at his malpractice insurance carrier to inform them that coverage was about to become relevant in ways nobody wanted to contemplate. "Dr. Hayes," the general said with the kind of calm that preceded career-ending decisions, "you were brought to this board to defend your position regarding the unauthorized procedure performed by Commander Morrison. Instead, we've discovered something far more serious. This board is recommending immediate suspension pending a full investigation by the North Carolina Medical Board. Your hospital privileges are revoked effective immediately. You will surrender your credentials and cease any patient contact as of this moment." Hayes tried to speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, gasping in an environment that could no longer sustain him. The security guard, Clayton, who'd served in Kandahar and recognized rank when he saw it, moved to the door and held it open with the polite insistence of someone escorting someone out. Hayes left the room. His attorney followed, already dialing. Webb reached across the table toward Katie, and when she took his hand, his grip was steady. "Welcome back, Phantom," he said quietly. "The Hindu Kush owes you one." Katie didn't smile. Smiling was for people who had the luxury of celebratory emotions. Instead, she nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that understood everything he'd just done and the risk he'd taken in breaking his own cover to save hers. Naval intelligence operatives didn't testify in hospital board meetings unless something was catastrophically important. Webb had burned whatever remaining classified connection he possessed to ensure she could continue the mission that had brought her to Oak Creek Memorial in the first place. Her reinstatement was unanimous and immediate. Back pay. Formal apology from the hospital board. Her position restored, her cover intact, her mission continuing. The conspiracy she'd been assigned to uncover, the contracted supply vendor who'd been selling patient information to a foreign operative, was still active. Still required her presence in that hospital, in that ICU, drawing blood, checking vitals, moving through the building like a ghost that nobody noticed. Like a nurse. Like nobody at all. For weeks passed. Hayes appeared before the North Carolina Medical Board in a room much colder and far less forgiving than the hospital conference room. 3 cases of altered records. 2 documented patient harm incidents. The testimony from colleagues who'd watched him alter timestamps but said nothing until it mattered. His medical license was suspended for 5 years. Hospital privileges permanently revoked. The hierarchy that had protected him, the board members who'd nodded silently while he humiliated Katie, the administrators who'd approved his documentation campaigns, quietly distanced themselves from him. Institutional power, it turned out, was a conditional thing. Once you became a liability instead of an asset, the distance could be measured in hours. Hayes spent those weeks boxing up his office. His nameplate came off the door. His diplomas came off the walls, their gilt frames glinting in fluorescent light that seemed suddenly harsher than it had before. His colleagues avoided him in hallways with the practiced elegance of people who'd never known him at all. The tenure he'd accumulated, the board memberships he'd leveraged, the administrative authority he'd weaponized, all of it evaporated the moment he stopped being useful. The system that had protected him worked like that. It protected power, not people. When the power dissipated, so did the protection. On his last day, as Hayes carried the final box toward the elevator, he glanced through the ICU windows. Katie moved between beds with the quiet competence of someone who'd been doing this for far longer than 2 months. She checked a patient's for, adjusted flow rates, entered notes into the electronic system with fingers that moved with precision born from thousands of hours of repetition. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge his existence. She was focused entirely on the work, the actual work, the real mission, the reason she'd come to Oak Creek Memorial in the first place. 2 years later, Katie Morrison walked the ICU floor during the night shift, moving between 12 beds with the careful efficiency of someone who'd memorized every contingency, every protocol, every possible crisis point. Her limp was barely noticeable now. The compartment syndrome in her own leg, the one she'd sustained while carrying Webb through enemy fire and never properly reported, had healed. Mostly. It still ached when the weather shifted and the barometric pressure dropped, but pain was data, and she'd been trained to process data without emotion. Lieutenant Commander Webb visited twice a year. He was back on active duty, commanding his own platoon now, stationed at Naval Base San Diego. When he came, he always found her, somehow knowing her schedule, finding her on the ICU floor as if drawn by some invisible tether between people who'd shared the specific gravity of survival. He still had her call sign tattooed on his forearm, though she'd advised against it. Operational security suggested avoiding permanent marks that identified asset networks. But Webb had his own career now, his own authority, and he made his own choices. He visited to say thank you. To remind her that the 7 other members of his original team, the ones who hadn't come back from San Juan Valley, now had a presence in the living memory of someone who refused to let them disappear. One evening, as Katie clocked out from her shift at 0630, she cut through the loading dock area where the medical supply deliveries arrived. A van idled near the entrance, unmarked white van, the kind that could belong to any of 100 contractors. But Katie knew the vehicle. Had studied its license plate during her counterintelligence briefing 6 months ago. She knew the man pushing a hand truck laden with boxes of surgical supplies toward the service entrance. Dr. Marcus Hayes had found work as a medical supply contractor. It was the kind of job available to people whose credentials had been revoked and whose professional reputation had been systematically dismantled, a position where you handled inventory instead of patients, where you pushed boxes instead of people toward recovery. His former kingdom had been reduced to clipboards and manifests, to the careful documentation of shipments instead of the careful documentation of patients. The man who'd spent years climbing institutional hierarchies now existed beneath them, a ghost in his own hospital, performing necessary labor that nobody would ever thank him for. He glanced up as Katie passed. Their eyes met for approximately 0.8 seconds, the kind of moment that existed in the space between recognition and acknowledgement. His face went carefully blank. He returned to his work. Katie continued toward her car without any change in pace, without any indication that she'd registered his presence at all. She felt nothing. No satisfaction. No pity. No sense of cosmic balance achieved. He'd made his choices, the system he'd weaponized had simply returned the favor. That was how institutional power worked. It consumed its own eventually. It always did. The faded unit patch sat in a frame on Katie's apartment shelf, behind the door of her bedroom closet, next to a photograph of 7 men in desert combat uniforms. 7 faces that would never age beyond the years captured in the print, 7 identities that existed now only in the memories of the people who'd survived them. Webb's name wasn't among the dead, but he understood the weight of their absence. He understood why Katie kept the patch close and the mission ongoing. The conspiracy she'd been assigned to monitor was neutralized 2 months after Hayes' suspension. The medical supply contractor, a man named Rodriguez who'd been operating a secondary business selling patient information to a foreign intelligence operative, was arrested at his warehouse in Durham. His communication network was disrupted. The leak was sealed. Katie's undercover position as a nurse in the ICU had been essential to identifying the pattern, to tracking the contractors who accessed patient files, to documenting the timing of information releases and their correlation with Rodriguez's communication bursts. Her naval intelligence assignment was technically complete. She could have requested reassignment, could have moved to a new city, a new cover, a new mission. But the work she did in the ICU, the actual work, the work that saved people who had no connection to classified operations or national security, seemed important in a way that transcended her assignment parameters. She'd carried Webb through 3 miles of enemy fire. She'd performed an emergency fasciotomy that saved his leg when every institutional barrier told her not to. She'd been willing to sacrifice everything because the mission mattered more than her comfort. So she stayed. Her naval intelligence supervisors approved her continued presence at Oak Creek Memorial, though the official justification involved monitoring ongoing counterintelligence developments. In reality, she was simply a nurse. The cover had become the truth. One evening, as she trained a new ICU nurse on emergency response protocols, Katie pulled up the compartment syndrome guidelines on the unit computer. "If you page for times and get no response," she said quietly, "document everything and trust your assessment. Some situations don't wait for permission. Some situations demand that you trust your own competence more than you trust institutional hierarchy." The young nurse, fresh from nursing school and 3 weeks into her first position, nodded without fully understanding the weight behind the words, the years of field hospitals, of decisions made without backup, of carrying people toward safety when every protocol said to wait for authorization. But the weight would settle on her eventually. It always did. Katie returned to the ICU. Checked vitals. Updated charts. Moved through the building with the quiet efficiency of someone nobody noticed. A nurse. A ghost. A woman who'd earned a Navy Cross for refusing to leave anyone behind, now spending her nights ensuring nobody in the ICU would experience abandonment on her shift. The patch was locked in her safe. The mission continued. The work was endless and necessary and invisible, exactly as she'd been trained to expect. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Tell me about a time you saw someone's hidden strength, someone everyone underestimated until the moment it mattered most. We'd love to hear from you.